Hey everybody, it's Julian or Flow Graphics here, and today I've got a really awesome layered 3D text effect to show you all. So this is an effect that I sort of made up in my own time, and then I thought it looks pretty cool, so I thought I'd make a video for all of you and teach you how to actually make it. So the first thing, just have Photoshop open, obviously. You could use this for a YouTube banner or a wallpaper, whatever you want. I'm just going to use sort of like a standard 1080p wallpaper size, but I suggest you actually make this text in a larger document first, and then if you want to use it in a banner or something like that, then you can sort of shrink it down and fit it into that size. So I'm just going to delete this example and we'll start. So the first thing we're going to need to do is use our type tool to type in our text. Otherwise, if you're using a logo or something else, that's fine, you can just use that instead. But I'm just going to hit T on my keyboard to go to my type tool, and I'll type in the word flow. I'll just make sure that's centered, and I'll just center that to my document. And then I'll just hit Control T, hold Shift and Alt, and then drag that up. Alternatively, you can just double click on the type, hold Control, and then click and drag on the font size to change the size of that. Once I have my first name, I'm going to actually add the second part of my name as well. So I just hit Control J to actually duplicate the text, that layer. Otherwise, you can just duplicate it down here. So you can just right click and then go duplicate. So yeah, now I've duplicated that, drag that down, and then I'll just type in the word graphics here. And then I just want to make sure this word, the graphics, lines up with flow. It doesn't have to be perfect, I think that should do. So I've got my text ready to go. Just make sure you've spelt your text properly, make sure it's all nice and neat, and you don't want to change it at all, because we actually have to rasterize our text layer before we go any further. So just make sure it's all good to go. So I'm just going to hit Control E just to merge those layers. Alternatively, you could just right click and go rasterize layer or rasterize layer style if you just have one object and you want to rasterize that. So now that we have our text, we're going to actually start transforming it to give it that 3D effect. I'm just going to hit Control T on my keyboard to bring up the transformation controls. And then the reason why we actually rasterized it is because the normal actual text object can't be transformed in the way that we want to transform this. So I'm just going to hold Control, click and drag on one of these anchor points, and you can see it starts to sort of give a really cool perspective to the text. And I'm just going to go around all these anchor points and basically start skewing the text to give this really cool perspective. So I want the left hand side of my text to be sort of closer towards the screen, and then the right hand a bit further. And I also want to have a little bit of a tilt, so the left hand side is a little bit more upright than the right hand side. It just adds a really cool effect. So I think actually that right there should look pretty good. And then I might just scale it down a little bit as well. And I like the look of that. I'm ready to go now. I've got my text and all the angle good. So just make sure before you do the next step, your angle is exactly how you want it. So I'm just going to double click of the right of the layer just to go to the layer styles panel. And we're going to add a bevel and emboss. This creates a pretty cool little highlight going along the edge of our text, which just adds to that 3D effect and makes it look a little bit better. So make sure you're on an inner bevel. Make sure the depth is all the way up. Then we can change the size. So we just want the size to be a few pixels big, so it just creates a nice little edging. And you can actually sort of change the opacity. I just have white and then overlay for the highlight. And then I have the shadows turned all the way down because I don't want any shadows. All I want is that nice little edging from the highlight. And for the angle, you can change this to whatever you want. I want the angle sort of coming from the top, or actually maybe from the bottom. Yeah, we'll do it from the bottom. So I've sort of got it diagonally left from the bottom. I think that looks good. Depending on how your text is tilted, you may have to change it for you. Otherwise, you can copy in my settings. I just have negative 130 and then 0. And for the sides, I'll probably put it around maybe 2 to 3 pixels. I think 2 pixels looks good, so I'm going to keep it like that. As for the opacity, I'll make it a little bit less, maybe around 60%. I think looks good, just so we have a nice subtle highlight on our text. I'm just going to press OK. And if you actually want to add one other little effect, I will just go back into layer styles. You could add a gradient overlay. Just make sure the gradient's a black to a white gradient. We just want to set the blend mode to overlay, and then you can just turn up the opacity, and you start to get this really cool gradient where the top of the text is a bit brighter and the bottom of the text is a bit darker. I suggest just do this sort of subtle. You don't want a really, really intense sort of gradient, and unless that's what you're looking for, it could look cool. But I'm just going to keep it around 30 or so percent for mine because I think that looks better. So I'll just press OK, and then we have our text. Once we have this text, it's pretty easy from here on out. It's actually pretty straightforward, and that's most of the hard work. So once I've got that done, what I'm going to do now is just hit Control J to duplicate that layer, And then on that bottom layer, I'm just going to rasterize the layer style. So all we do is we just have a copy of the layer. Now I'm going to hit Control U to go into my hue and saturation on that duplicated layer. And I'm just going to drag down the lightness a little bit just so I can see that this back layer is a little bit darker than the top layer. Now I've done that. Going to my keyboard, I'm just going to hit the down arrow once and the left arrow once, sorry. And then I'm going to hit Control J to duplicate and then do that exact same thing. Down arrow once, right arrow once. Then I'm going to hit Control E, Control J, and we're just going to do this a couple times. So all I'm doing is just duplicating the layer, hitting the right arrow once, the down arrow once, and then merging it back together. I actually did a similar technique to this in one of my other tutorials. It's just sort of like a quick, easy way. It may be sort of like a cheap way to get like a 3D sort of shadow on your text, but it's just sort of pretty straightforward and simple. So that's why I like it. So that's sort of done as it is now. I'll just make sure that's merged like that. And then if I hit Control U on my keyboard again, we can just drag down the lightness of that layer, and then I might drag up the saturation a little bit. We could also change the hue. So I might make the hue a little bit more bluey for this background sort of shadow. I may drag the lightness a little bit more down. So we start to see we have this really awesome 3D text. And you wouldn't really realize we actually did it the way that we did it. It's pretty straightforward. It's just a really cool way to actually get 3D text. If you want, you could just stop right now and use this text as it is, but I'm going to keep going and then add that sort of layered effect like I showed you in the start. So once we have our text made up and ready to go, I'm actually going to combine both these layers together. So I'm just going to hit Control, select them both, and hit Control G to group them. Now I want to save this just in case I muck up anything, so I'm just going to hit Control J and then I'll turn off that bottom layer just in case I need to change anything or if I stuff it up or something. So now I've got this top layer here. I'm going to hit Control J on that top layer, and then the bottom layer that we just sort of duplicated, I'm going to hit Control E. If you hit Control E on a group, it automatically just sort of mushes all that group together and rasterizes that into one solid layer. So we can see we just have one solid layer here. And now what I can do is just drag this layer back behind our top text layer, and we start to get sort of like this layered effect. Now I'm going to hit Control U on my keyboard again. I'm going to make the lightness a bit less. I'm going to drag up the saturation, and I'll make the hue a little bit more bluey as well. Maybe the lightness not so much. Just so we sort of get a darker copy of our text behind it like this. And then now what we're going to do is I'll actually use the top layer for this since the background layer is a bit too dark. I'll just hit Control J to duplicate that top blue layer, hit Control E like we did before to merge it, drag it right back behind all of our layers, and then just do the exact same thing we did before. Put that behind those layers, just make sure it lines up nicely. Now for this layer, I'm not just going to change the hue, that might not cut it. I'm going to double click on the layer, go to its layer styles, go to color overlay, and then we just want to select a nice orange. You could sort of select whatever color you want. You can pick a green or purple. I just thought the orange was good with the blue because it's a really nice sort of contrasting color. So I'm just going to click on that. And then what we can do is scroll through the blend modes and we get all sorts of cool effects. Usually light and color looks pretty good. So I'm just going to stick it on that. And then what I'm also going to do is add an inner glow. I actually think these settings are pretty somewhat on point to start with. So what we need to do is just put the opacity all the way up so you can sort of see what you're doing. And then for the inner glow, all we want to have is sort of like this nice little backing highlight going around the edge of this orange. And to achieve this effect, we're just going to make the size just a little bit, maybe around at least 13 pixels seems to work for me. So we just want this nice little glare coming off the edge of this orange here, and then just make sure the blend mode is overlay. And then I actually might make the size a little bit less, around 7 pixels should be good. And then I'll drag down the opacity just so I have this nice sort of subtle highlight going around our orange. And then we'll add one more effect to this, which is an outer glow. So I'll click on outer glow. We just want to make sure it's orange. You can just sort of color pick the orange from your text or make your own orange. What actually does look a little bit more realistic, a little bit cooler, is if you make the orange just a shade a little bit sort of more red than the original shade. So if you had a bit more of a yellow, make it a bit more orange. If you had an orange, make it a tint sort of reddy, the glow. And it just looks pretty cool. So I'm just going to hit OK. And then you can see we have our nice outer glow here. I just got the blend mode to light and color. Otherwise you could do it on screen or something else as well. And then we're just going to make the opacity nice and faint, around 20 to 30% should be good for this. And then I'll just hit OK to commit those changes. And there we go. As you can see, we have this awesome glowing 3D text effect now that we made pretty quickly. If you want to customize this effect and add some other cool little sort of things to it, what we can do is up the brightness and the contrast a little bit if you want to make it sort of pop a little bit more. So that looks pretty cool like that. Otherwise, we can also just add a hue and saturation layer, and then we can change the color of the text if we want. Maybe I want it to be, you know, any other sort of color. So we can do that and get all sorts of really cool effects. I think that green actually looks pretty cool. So that's basically the text there. One thing to note is the way we actually transform this text. It might get a little bit pixely on the side that you sort of skewed outwards, as you can see here. You can see it's a little bit bumpy. So make sure when you're actually making this text that it's nice and large scale, because you may have to downsize a little bit. You could just sort of select all these layers and just scale it in, and then just make sure the text is basically bigger than whatever you're making it for, because you might get this little pixely effect on the edge there, which doesn't look too great. It's not really a huge big deal, but it's just something to take note of. So I hope you all enjoyed the tutorial, everybody. It was just sort of like a quick little one where I thought you would all appreciate how to make this really cool text effect. So if you have any ideas for future tutorials, any videos you'd like me to make, be sure to let me know in the comments. And as always, everybody, I hope you have an awesome day. See ya.